They say the dead find peace on the battlefield, but the living are not so fortunate. When an emperor crushed a rebellion or conquered a rival, the general's body might be buried with honors or left for the vultures, but his widow, she became something worse than a corpse. She was turned into a message, a breathing trophy, a silent warning to every other woman who might dare dream of power. What emperors did to them was not mercy, it was worse than death. The clash of armies was only the first part of defeat. When the dust of battle settled and the smoke of burning standards drifted into the sky, the emperor's attention turned not only to the fallen men but to the women left behind. The widow of a defeated general was never allowed to grieve as a wife. Instead, she became an extension of her husband's punishment, living proof of his failure, and a tool by which the emperor could strike fear into every corner of his realm. She was pulled from her home before the mourning cloth could even cover her head, stripped of jewels, lands, and voice. Servants who once bowed to her now turned their faces as if her presence carried contagion. No dirges were sung for her husband, no prayers spoken. The widow was denied the sacred rhythm of grief, forced to watch as the emperor's messengers claimed her house, her children, and even the memories of her marriage. For the empire, she was no longer a person but an instrument. Some emperors forced her to stand before the court, her hair unbound in shame, her garments torn to display her helplessness, while courtiers laughed as though her suffering were entertainment. Others marched her through the streets, making her a spectacle to the crowds, proof that rebellion or failure left not only a general dead but his family disgraced. These widows did not receive the comfort of silence or the dignity of mourning. They were condemned to live as shadows of the men who had once led armies. To be the wife of a defeated general was to inherit his dishonor, and the empire ensured that every gaze, every whisper, and every law reminded her that her fate was sealed. Death would have closed her eyes to humiliation. Life kept them open, and in that open gaze, the empire found its most terrible weapon. The widow's first steps inside the palace were not her own. Guards led her, not with chains but with the weight of silence that pressed against her body like iron. She was made to walk slowly, deliberately, so that each movement became a ritual of disgrace. The emperor's court was waiting, the air heavy with perfume and the murmurs of nobles who gathered not to offer sympathy but to witness humiliation dressed as ceremony. She was brought forward as though she were a prize animal returning from the hunt, and every eye studied her not for who she was but for what she represented, the broken pride of a man who had once dared to defy the throne. Her mourning veil was stripped away, sometimes by a servant, sometimes by the emperor himself, so that her face was exposed to the assembly. Every tear, every flicker of fear was savored, a spectacle to be remembered and retold. In some accounts, the widow was forced to kneel at the emperor's feet, her hair pulled loose to the ground, while courtiers jeered, their laughter echoing off the marble walls like cruel hymns. It was not enough that her husband was gone. His defeat was not complete until she carried it into the heart of power, her presence a living banner of submission. Some emperors commanded that she wear her husband's bloodied armor, far too large for her frame, dragging across the floor as she stumbled forward. Her shame multiplied with every falter. Others dressed her in finery torn and mismatched, mocking the dignity she once held as a noble wife. The court was never content with silence, it demanded spectacle. She might be ordered to pour wine for those who mocked her, her hands trembling as she served the very men who had conspired against her family. Sometimes she was made to dance, her body moving not with grace but under duress, a cruel parody of the festivals she once attended as an honored guest. And all the while, the emperor watched, his eyes not fixed on her but on the men in the room, ensuring they understood what awaited any who would raise a sword against him. Her suffering was not for herself, it was a performance staged to instruct, a reminder that loyalty was not only rewarded, but that defiance would poison even the survivors. When the spectacle ended, she was not dismissed with honor but dragged away, her name already changed in the whispers of the court. She was no longer the widow of a general. She was an example, a cautionary tale, a shadow wandering within palace walls. To live through such a parade was to be stripped of identity until only shame remained. And yet, the worst was not over. The emperor had many ways to extend defeat, and the court was only the beginning of her undoing. The true cruelty of the emperor did not end with parades and mockery, for humiliation fades with time, but lineage was eternal. To truly erase the memory of a defeated general, the empire struck at his bloodline, severing it so thoroughly that no child, no name, no heir could rise to claim revenge. The widow was the vessel through which this erasure was carried out, her body and her future stolen and reshaped by decree. Some emperors forced widows to remarry, not by choice but by command, binding them to men of low rank or obscure standing. A woman who once presided over a household of soldiers, who once held her place in the circle of nobility, would wake to find herself given to a stable master, a guard, or even a court jester. The insult was deliberate, for it dragged her bloodline downward, mixing what was once proud with what was considered base, ensuring that no descendant could ever claim noble origin again. Children of these forced unions were reminders of defeat, marked as living proof that the general's house had been conquered, not only on the battlefield but within the walls of his home. Others were not permitted even that twisted fate. Some widows were forbidden from marrying at all, their lives placed under watch in secluded villas, their beauty and status wasted in endless solitude. Without marriage, there could be no children, and without children, a family name shriveled into silence within a single generation. The empire needed no sword to kill a dynasty, it only needed time and the manipulation of a woman's womb. In darker accounts, widows were compelled to bear children for the victors themselves, their bodies turned into weapons of succession. By forcing them into the emperor's household, the blood of the defeated was drowned in the blood of the conqueror, ensuring that future heirs carried not the legacy of rebellion but the mark of obedience. Each birth became an act of conquest, every child a reminder that lineage itself had been conquered as surely as a fortress. The theft of lineage was not swift, and that was its horror. A battlefield death was sudden, violent, and final. But for widows, it unfolded over years, each day a reminder that the name they once carried was now dust, that their children, if they lived, would never inherit pride but only the burden of being descendants of the defeated. To live under such conditions was to carry a funeral inside one's body, mourning not only the man who was lost but the generations that would never be born. And in this silence, the emperor triumphed again and again, long after swords had been sheathed, long after bones had turned to earth. It was not death but a living erasure, one designed to choke memory until no voice dared to whisper the name of the fallen general. The widows who were not paraded through courts or forced into marriages often met a quieter, more suffocating fate. They were sent away, not with the dignity of retreat but with the crushing weight of exile into silence. Some were locked behind convent walls, their hair shorn, their noble clothes replaced with rough wool, their lives reduced to endless prayer that was not chosen but commanded. Others were hidden in remote estates, watched by guards who were less protectors and more jailers, ensuring that no letter, no whisper, no memory of rebellion could escape through their lips. These women walked through gardens they could not leave, slept in chambers stripped of luxury, and heard the echo of their own voices fade into nothingness. The cloister of silence was designed not to punish the body but to erase the soul, to reduce once powerful wives into shadows of obedience. For some, it was worse than chains, for chains at least admitted captivity. Here, their imprisonment was disguised as piety, as duty, as protection, though all knew the truth that they were sealed away to die unseen. Days turned into seasons, and seasons into years, until faces once remembered grew distant in memory. Servants who once bowed now looked through them as though they were specters, haunting a house no longer their own. Children, if they had them, were often taken and raised by others, stripped of their mother's voice, ensuring that the bond between blood and memory was severed forever. The widow herself became a ghost long before her body gave out. She might kneel in prayer until her knees bled, but her words never reached heaven, for they were spoken under compulsion, not faith. Even death lost its meaning here. When the end came, there were no public funerals, no mourners gathered with songs of grief. She was buried in quiet ground, her name whispered only once by a priest who would forget it the next day. The empire had no need to spill her blood in public squares. The silence itself was a weapon sharper than any blade. And in that silence, the message was clear. Defiance not only claimed a man's life, but consumed the future of his wife. Her existence folded into the shadows where no story was ever told. The cloister of silence was not built of stone and mortar alone. It was built of fear, of memory erased, of women forced to live as though they were already dead. To walk its halls was to hear the faint echoes of lives undone, each step a reminder that survival did not always mean freedom. Sometimes it meant a slower death, one measured not in wounds but in years, until nothing remained but silence itself. For some widows, exile and silence were denied. Instead, they were kept within the very palace that had ordered their ruin, transformed into unwilling actors in a theater of cruelty. To the emperor, their grief was not sacred but useful, a spectacle meant to entertain and instruct. They were forced to appear at feasts, draped not in mourning black but in garments chosen by others, silks cut to mockery, jewels borrowed only to glitter in the torchlight of their humiliation. Courtiers watched with delight as the widow of a fallen general poured wine with trembling hands, her service a reminder that her pride had been broken. She was not treated as a guest, nor even as a prisoner, but as a prop in the emperor's performance of dominance. At times, the emperor demanded that she sing, though her voice cracked under the weight of sorrow, or that she dance while the laughter of the court roared louder than the music. These were not acts of grace but rituals of degradation, designed to turn her into an echo of the power she once embodied. In darker accounts, widows were forced to reenact fragments of their husband's downfall, compelled to kneel before actors dressed as soldiers, or to recite words of submission while the court applauded. Every detail was calculated to transform private suffering into public amusement. The emperor's cruelty was not always loud. Sometimes it was subtle, woven into small humiliations that lasted a lifetime. A widow might be made to serve at the table of the very man who had betrayed her husband, her silence expected as he boasted of victories gained from her family's ruin. Another might be ordered to carry messages between courtiers, her dignity reduced to errands no servant desired, her status crumbling with each menial task. What made it unbearable was not only the act itself but the audience. Each humiliation was staged for eyes to see, for ears to hear, for tongues to repeat in whispers across the empire. It was theater as power, cruelty as law, and yet, beneath the spectacle lay the emperor's coldest design. By breaking the widow publicly, he reminded every man in attendance that their wives, too, could be turned into tools of disgrace. The message seeped into the marrow of the empire. Loyalty was survival, rebellion a legacy of ruin. For the widow, there was no reprieve. She lived as a performance, every breath taken under the gaze of those who waited for her to falter. Death, had it come, would have offered release. Life, however, demanded she continue as a plaything in a theater where her pain was the punchline. And as the music swelled, as the torches burned low, as the emperor raised his cup in triumph, she stood in silence, knowing that her suffering was not her own but a show scripted by power, repeated until memory itself grew weary. The emperor's greatest fear was not the fallen general lying in the earth, but the possibility of his blood rising again. A son could grow into a rival, a daughter into a vessel of alliance, and so the widow's womb became the most dangerous battlefield of all. To leave her free was to risk the birth of vengeance, and so her body was bound to the designs of the empire. Some were forced into unions with men chosen not for love but for loyalty to the throne, their children diluted into obscurity, their lineage dissolved into anonymity. Others were denied marriage altogether, locked away so that no seed of rebellion could ever be sown. Their empty arms a daily reminder that the empire had stolen not only their present but their future. But there were cruelties darker still. In the whispered accounts that survive, widows were compelled to bear children for the victors themselves, their pregnancies turned into instruments of conquest. A general's widow who once hoped to carry her husband's line instead delivered heirs to the same throne that had orchestrated his death. Each birth was both a triumph and a desecration, the cries of newborns echoing not with joy but with the silence of bloodlines extinguished. There were times when widows were forced into rituals meant to pollute their wombs, their bodies treated as soil to be salted so that nothing of their former lives could grow again. Even when children were born, the cruelty did not cease. Sons of defeated generals were often taken from their mothers' arms, raised as hostages within the palace, their loyalty trained to the emperor who had destroyed their family. Some were executed quietly, before they had even learned to walk. Their small lives ended in the name of stability. Daughters fared no better, sold into marriages designed to scatter their blood across the empire until their ancestry was forgotten entirely. For the widow, this theft of the womb was a punishment that reached deeper than chains or exile. She was forced to live not only with the loss of her husband, but with the knowledge that her very body had been turned against her, her fertility corrupted into a weapon wielded by the throne. To carry life under such conditions was to carry a coffin. For each child born was another nail sealing shut the legacy she once hoped to protect. Death would have offered her husband dignity and her children freedom in memory, but the emperor's cruelty stretched beyond the grave, twisting life itself into another form of defeat. The womb was no longer hers, the future no longer her family's. It belonged to the empire, and through it the emperor ensured that even generations yet unborn would bear the mark of conquest. The cruelty of emperors did not end with the breaking of bodies or the theft of wombs, for power was never satisfied until memory itself was bent to its will. To destroy a general on the battlefield was one thing, but to erase the very existence of his widow ensured that no seed of remembrance could grow in the soil of time. Records were altered with deliberate precision. Scribes were ordered to scratch names from family rolls, to blot out signatures, to remove any trace of a woman's life from the archives. Marble busts were defaced, their features chiseled away until only hollow outlines remained, reminders that a face had once existed but was no longer permitted to be remembered. In mosaics and tapestries, the images of wives were painted over, their likeness replaced with flowers, saints, or nameless figures. It was as though they had never breathed, never walked, never carried the weight of love or loss. This erasure spread beyond official record into the marrow of daily life. Families were forbidden to speak their names aloud, as though a single utterance might reignite rebellion. Friends who once shared laughter turned their faces in fear, refusing to acknowledge that they had ever known them. Children were told different stories of their mothers, or none at all, until memory itself grew tangled, leaving only silence where once there had been lineage. The widow who remained alive endured a punishment worse than death, for she was forced to watch her own identity dissolve in the eyes of others. She might pass someone who once knelt at her table, only to see them glance away as if she were a ghost, her existence too dangerous to be acknowledged. The streets she once walked became foreign, her presence unwelcome, her shadow unrecognized. Even the earth conspired in her erasure, as unmarked graves swallowed the remains of those like her, leaving no stone to testify that she had lived or suffered. For an empire, this was victory perfected, to kill without killing, to bury while still leaving the body above ground. What terrified the widows most was not the loss of their wealth or their homes, but the knowledge that they would leave nothing behind. No story, no prayer, no whispered remembrance would survive the empire's command to forget. The silence was total, and it devoured them slowly. In the end, they became less than ghosts, for even spirits carry names on the lips of the living. These women were given none. The emperor's design was clear to show the world that rebellion left no trace, that even the women who bore its memory would vanish into nothing. And in this vanishing, the empire carved its most enduring monument, not stone or marble, but the silence where once there had been lives. For the widows of defeated generals, death was never the final mercy. Their punishment lingered long after their bodies had turned cold, woven into the fabric of memory and fear that the empire spread like a shroud. In life they had been paraded, mocked, and silenced, but in death they were denied even the dignity that ordinary souls received. Their burials were often secret, carried out at night with no rites, no mourners, no prayers to guide them into the afterlife. Graves were left unmarked, or worse, left open to the elements so that time itself would consume their remains. For those kept alive in cloisters or palaces, their deaths brought no release, for the empire ensured that their names were never spoken again. Their children taught not to honor them, but to forget them. In some places their bones were scattered far from their families, cast into rivers or burned with refuse, their identities reduced to ash. The cruelty of the emperor was not only to control the living but to govern the memory of the dead, to shape the past so completely that no trace of defiance could linger. Yet their absence was not silent. The very erasure became its own haunting, for whispers survived in corridors, in kitchens, in the faintest breath of rumor passed from servant to servant. People remembered the women not as they were, but as warnings, their fates recounted in half-spoken stories to frighten daughters into obedience. Thus their punishment endured beyond the grave, not as legacy but as a shadow that clung to generations. Death would have closed the circle of their suffering, but instead it extended endlessly, their identities obliterated, yet their terror immortalized. The empire had achieved what it desired most, to make rebellion unthinkable, not through execution alone, but through the fear that even death would not end disgrace. For a soldier, to fall in battle was an end. For his widow, there was no end. Her life was stripped away piece by piece, and when death finally arrived, it brought no freedom, only another chapter in her humiliation. She was left with nothing to carry into eternity, no name, no story, no memory, and so the punishment stretched beyond the limits of flesh, etched into silence itself. This was the cruelty of emperors, that they did not stop at conquest of land or armies, but reached further, into the lives of women, into their bodies, into their children, into the very memory of their existence. To kill a general was to win a battle. To destroy his widow, even after her death, was to win forever. That was the punishment beyond death, a punishment designed not only to erase but to endure, echoing long after the last cry, the last breath, the last grave had been covered. History remembers the victories of emperors, but it buries the voices of the women who paid the hidden price. The widows of defeated generals were not just punished in life, they were erased, humiliated, and silenced so completely that even death was denied them as mercy. Their suffering lingers in the shadows of history, a reminder that conquest is not only written in blood on the battlefield, but in silence, forced upon the living. If you want more stories of forgotten women, erased voices, and the cruelties history tried to hide, subscribe to Forgotten Stories, Ancient World, and help uncover what was never meant to be remembered.